I have decided to do my documentary review over a documentary I have watched previously, but never looked at in a sport management lens, Athlete A. It's about how the Indianapolis Star uncovered USA Gymnastics and how they dealt with abuse claims. In 2016, they were doing an investigation into the failure to report sexual abuse in school. As they started to investigate the questions surrounding why this was happening, a source told them to investigate USA Gymnastics and how they dealt with reports. What they found was a shocking policy that harmed many gymnasts. Steve Penny Jr., the president of USA Gymnastics at the time, said that they do not turn in complaints of sexual misconduct to local authorities. Instead, he sees them as hearsay until the complaints are signed by a victim, a parent of the victim, or an eyewitness of the complaint. What the Star found was over 54 complaints against coaches that were reported but never signed. As they started to uncover a little bit more, a former gymnast came forward and said that they were not abused by a coach, but by rather Dr. Larry Nasser. And then another came, and then another came. They all happened to come forward on their own without knowledge that someone else was doing the same. At one point in 2015, a coach overheard two athletes, Maggie Nichols and Allie Raisman, talking. Maggie asked Allie if Dr. Nasser touched her inappropriately as well, in which Allie had confirmed. The coach was concerned and told Nichols' parents. She also said she would tell the head of the women's gymnastics at the time for USAG, Rhonda Fay. A day later, Penny called the parents saying he would take care of it and not to worry. He had the gymnast's best interests in mind. What we find out later is that he did nothing. USAG had a wholesome image, and he wanted to keep that up and not have anything ruin that. But we find out that the reality of the fact is that kids would be going to these training camps as early as the age of 10, and there they are getting emotionally, verbally, and sometimes physically abused. It was nothing like the wholesome image that was promoted. Now, as they grew up over time and continued in the system, this created a confusing mindset between the three different types of abuses they may have faced. When they got even older and something like sexual abuse happened, they don't know what to think, who to trust, or what to do. The adults were supposed to be caring and protecting of them, but they weren't. From here in the documentary, they start to go into like three different former gymnasts and their cases, but I'm going to talk mostly about Maggie Nichols since the documentary kind of revolves around her. So in June of 2015, she reported that abuse we talked about earlier. She said that at the time, she was one of the top hopefuls for the Olympics in Rio de Janeiro when she placed second at the 2015 all around. Now, when it came to the Olympic trials, she ended up placing sixth in the all around because she had a knee injury a little bit prior and she was still coming back from it. But she placed sixth. Now, at the time in Olympic gymnastics, you could have five people on the team and then you'd have three alternates. She placed sixth and she ended up not being one of the eight, period. Now, at the time, there was still the idea of that the case was going on and no one knew what was happening. But we find out later that it took 5 weeks from the initial report to the USAG submitting it to the authorities. And in Texas, you're supposed to submit these right away. So this was illegal. Now, while that was going on, a little later, well, still in 2016, I guess, Rachel Den Hollander had a case in Michigan. She was a former gymnast as well. When they were uncovering and looking at it closer, they realized that there was a 2014 investigation reporting that Dr. Larry Nasser had sexually assaulted someone else, sexually abused someone else. At this point, the Star felt like they had enough information that they could submit and then publish this report. So they published their article on the abuses, and each day more and more survivors were calling them. And it wasn't just that they were calling them. Michigan State, which was where Dr. Nasser was currently at, they ended up getting over 24 reports, and Dr. Nasser got fired. Now, the police ended up going to his house with a search warrant in September of 2016, and they found multiple hard drives full of over 37,000 images of child pornography. He was arrested on three different counts and reached a plea day. On the day of his sentences, he had to listen to everyone who had been abused if they wanted to speak, and he was sentenced to two 60-year sentences. From now, we find out that over 500 people and 9 Olympians were abused by him. And USA Gymnastics actually had at least one, if not more people, have to sign an NDA so that they could not talk about it. Now, when we get into the name of the documentary, Athlete A, it's because Maggie Nichols was the first to report the abuse case. When we go into three ideas or themes, I want to relate it back to module two. The first one I think of is in the deviance, violence, and harm section, where we read about social harm and what harm in general is associated with. It does not take long for us in the documentary before we realize and see the amount of harm that was done from the moment that they were kids until the moment that they get into even now in their adult lives. When that harm was inflicted, they were confused about what was happening. But when they find out what exactly happened, that it's like reliving it all over down the road. The second theme is in sport of social justice, where they talk about sports can be a vehicle to educate and empower people to treat humans with equality. What we see really for me is while this was not the first thing in the Me Too movement, it helped a lot. And maybe they saw other people from before, and that's what made them come forward. But they definitely helped people in the future feel like it's okay to come forward for what happened. Just look at the 2018 ESPYs when the gymnasts abuse survivors came forward to accept the Arthur Ashe Courage Award. It was inspirational. It was so inspirational. That's the only way you can describe it. Now, the third one and the last one is in the economics and elite group section, and it notes how the elite group can influence different activities and different parts of sports. We saw it with President Roosevelt asking two different people to produce the official, safer, modern day helmet we see. In the case of USA Gymnastics, we see how the elite covered up the allegations and complaints and abuses that went on. All it would have taken is one person to notice what was happening and stop it, but no one did. Now, when we think about sports and a leader, it's hard to come up with an exact definition of what you see as a leader, but I usually see it as someone who has the best interest of mind, the hardest worker, things like that. Now, when you think of a front office, you want someone who's going to put the best team together and cares about the people. But USA Gymnastics did not do this because they allowed Nasser to continue and covered up for everything that he did. When we think of the critical thinking side of it, Merriam-Webster defines critical thinking as the act or practice of thinking critically to solve problems, evaluate information, and discern biases. Penny Jr. did a terrible job of doing this because he did not do anything, and the repercussions of what happened with Nasser actually ended up hurting more people. USA Gymnastics had to pay for it all, and he ended up getting arrested at one point. My biggest takeaway from this is that we need to do better as sports professionals. These people come in wanting to play sports, maybe do better for their family, but what they get is not always the case. Just think of Penn State and Jerry Sandusky and everything that happened there. We need to provide a safe place for these athletes to just be able to play that sport that they want.